Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Repeat an action often enough times in your own private life and it becomes a habit. An action that you don't even have to consciously think about anymore. You just have to rely on muscle memory. You automatically do it without consciously thinking about it. Well, there is something like that in the public sphere as well, because if a society allows a certain type of action or certain words to be repeated over and over and over again, then those actions, those words become normalized within that society, even if they started on the very periphery and were recognized when they were first introduced as disgusting, terrible, asinine, horrendous, immoral. If you repeat them, people will generally grow to accept them because that is just the way things are. People's nerves, people's sense of outrage gradually goes away the more often they see a particular action, the more often they hear a particular word. I mean, just compare the music today with the music from the 1940s and 50s to see my point. Well, now, this has happened, gang, with flag burning. Last year, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, we saw the American flag treated abysmally. We saw it torn down from flag posts. We saw it run over by cars. We even saw it wrapped around statues' heads. There was a famous example, the head of a statue of George Washington. The American flag was wrapped around the statue's head, set on fire before the statue was actually toppled over to the ground. And now, gang, flag burning has become so normalized now, despite the tears and the protests of outrage and sadness. It has become normalized now, and it is now ascending upwards from the level of the mob to now what we might call the petit bourgeois, or even the elites, the level of the elites. And last month in June, we had two wonderful examples of this. First, Mara Gay, an MSNBC contributor as well as part of the New York Times opinion column, or opinion editorial board, declared on MSNBC that seeing Americans flying the American flag in America, Long Island, especially, particularly here was her example, actually caused her distress because that was a dog whistle, she explained. It meant that these people were telling everyone else that America belonged to them and not to anyone else. That was the first example. Second example is a bit more recent. It comes from Gwen Berry, a 31-year-old young woman who is actually going to the Olympics as part of America's hammer throwing team, who actively turned her back to the flag while the national anthem was being played, and even covered her head with her shirt while it was being played. And what was even more amazing, gang, is that when she received the predictable backlash to her action, she reacted to the backlash by trying to say that she loves America. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful, but she just doesn't think that honoring the flag like that actually does any good right now, because there are just so many injustices. People actually have to stand up for their people. She has to stand up for her quote-unquote people. She seems to have forgotten that actions speak louder than words, and she can protest until the cows come home and she's blue in the face that she meant no disrespect, that she loves America. But when you actively turn your back to the most primordial symbol of your country while your country's national anthem is being played, that speaks volumes, and it speaks more eloquently than any other words that you might have. So there you go. Flag burning, the disrespect, not just even flag burning, but the disrespect, the desacralization of the American flag. Again, our most primordial symbol of our home, our country, has now been normalized. And the people most responsible for this, gang, are not the left, which you might actually have been expecting me to say, but actually the postmodern mainstream American conservative movement. And those of you who have been around my channel before probably knew that I was going to say this. Prominent people in the mainstream conservative movement, such as Allie Beth Stuckey, have said now several times that flag burning, while it might be distasteful, while it might be inappropriate, while it might be maddening, while it might be a host of terrible, horrible things, has to be tolerated because you know what? It's free speech. And in a perverted sense, having people have the power to burn the flag or actually even symbolically kill the country through vehicular homicide by running over the flag is actually proof that America is fine and dandy because, in Stuckey's words, the great strength of the stripes and stars is that people can actually burn it, because when they're burning it, they are exercising their free speech. They are exercising freedom, and it shows the world how radically and seriously we take our idea of liberty. Now, I made a video last year around this same time, as a matter of fact, why this idea was asinine, and I approached this idea from the perspective that our country, it's not just an arbitrary geographic space where a bunch of disparate people live together, try to make a living while also trying to tolerate each other while secretly wanting to murder your neighbor because his kid, his dog, or whatever, starts blaring at 2 o'clock in the morning. In fact, today with the birth rates declining as it is, it's probably not children, it's probably just loud music. I said to the contrary, that countries are actually our home. Just like we have a private home in a specific neighborhood, well, our country is our home in the global sense. And just like you wouldn't allow people to attack your home, we are mad if we allow people to attack our homeland, our national home, by allowing them to attack, disrespect, and desacralize the basic symbol that stands for our country, the symbol that within it contains our history, our heritage, our culture, and our hopes for the future. We would be mad to do that. But today, I want to do something a bit more daring and a bit more bold, if I may actually say that. I want to argue that despite the protests of people like Allie Beth Stuckey, flag burning is not part of the First Amendment. It is not free speech. And it is madness to think so. And in fact, it's worse than madness. It is actually civilizational suicide to argue that flag burning is protected by free speech. Now, before I dive into why flag burning and disrespect for the flag in general is not protected by free speech, I have to set up the preliminary. The idea that flag burning and the general desacralization of the flag is free speech only came about in 1989 when the Supreme Court in Texas versus Johnson declared that flag burning was a part of symbolic speech, which it had already declared in 1969 was a legitimate form of speech protected by the First Amendment. So already we have an interesting set of circumstances. First of all, the fact that the category of symbolic speech is relatively new. Again, the Supreme Court actually codified symbolic speech in the 60s when the counterculture raised its head for the first time fully, even though the Supreme Court had sort of played with the idea of symbolic speech earlier than that. In 1931, I believe, it heard a case that touched on symbolic speech. But what I find interesting is how the court actually defined symbolic speech. The Supreme Court, according to thoughtcode.com, defines symbolic speech as a type of nonverbal communication that takes the form of an action in order to communicate a specific belief. Now that is very important, gang, because the condition that symbolic speech actually conveys a specific belief completely undermines when people say, it completely undermines the idea that flag burning is a part of symbolic speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment, even if we granted that symbolic speech is a legitimate category of speech that is protected by the American Constitution. The reason why is because if you see a person or persons in a street, in a public place, burning an American flag, You do not know what belief they are expressing. You do not know what cause they are protesting simply by seeing the act of the flag being burned, run over, ripped apart, or whatever they might else be doing to it. You have absolutely no idea. Are they protesting a specific action of the government? Are they protesting a specific action of a specific branch of the government? A bill that Congress just passed, or a Supreme Court case that was just decided? Are they protesting a specific person, a Supreme Court justice, a congressman, a senator, a president, or because we now live in the world where the 1619 Project and just the general bastardization of history is now a reality, are they not even protesting the government? Are they protesting the country in general? Because now, thanks to Nicole Hannah-Jones and the other brain trust that we have as our national elite, we have now been informed that the country was a mistake from the beginning and that America was always an oppressive, white, patriarchal, imperialistic country right from its founding, which was, incidentally, not 1776, but 1619. You don't know, gang. The only way you are actually going to be able to know what specific belief these people are trying to convey by burning the flag is by wading into that group and asking them point blank, hey, what's all the fuss about? But here's the thing, gang. Even if we could magically know what specific belief people were conveying by their act of desacralization of the American flag, whether that was burning or whatever else their imaginations, their perverted imaginations had made them, But here's the thing, gang. Even if we could magically know what specific belief people were conveying when they desacralized the flag by burning it or whatever else their perverted imaginations had inspired them to do, even if we could magically know that, which meant that flag burning, flag desacralization was part of symbolic speech as the Supreme Court has defined it, which meant that it was protected under the First Amendment, it would still be an asinine idea. And not just in the patriotic and moral sense, but in the existential sense. Because when you say that one of the pillars of freedom requires that every Tom, Dick, and Harry can treat your basic, fundamental symbol of the nation in any way they want, you have opened the flood doors to the open society. Which, FYI, is a bad thing because the road down to the open society is also the road towards national suicide. And to understand why that is, we have to revisit a thinker whom I've mentioned here before, but who has been criminally neglected in our day and age. A guy by the name of Willmoore Kendall. Now, Willmoore Kendall was one of the intellectual lightstones of post-war conservatism, post-war being World War II. He was a contemporary of people like William F. Buckley, Frank Meyer, Leo Strauss, Harry Jaffa, and my man, Russell Kirk. The thing is, however, unlike those gentlemen, Kendall never actually got a large following, as can be seen today. I mean, you say the name Kendall Willmoore, and people will look at you like, huh? And there's a reason for that. Whereas Buckley and Kirk and Jaffa and Strauss wrote book after book after book in which they laid out, explained, elucidated their idea of conservatism, the ins and outs of the philosophy, what it meant, how it could be implemented in their day and age, how future generations might be able to implement it. Willmoore did no such thing. Oh, he wrote tons of essays and he wrote tons of book reviews, but he never actually sat down and wrote an actual book where he articulated his vision of conservatism. And in fact, he left a lot of projects undone, as a matter of fact, which FYI actually drove him to alcoholism. He would get into these creative funks where he knew he wasn't finishing projects, which then, of course, battered his self-esteem, his sense of worth. He turned to the alcohol, and he eventually, I believe, died, at least partially because of the alcoholism. But needless to say, despite his flaws, and despite his sort of being the black sheep of the conservative movement, I mean, he crossed swords with Kirk and Buckley Berkeley and Strauss and Jaffa. He crossed swords with all of them. He was kind of a curmudgeon fellow, which is one reason why I like him, even when I don't always necessarily agree with him. He was an intellectual giant, as they all were in that day and age. And one of the essays that Kendall wrote was a little piece called The Open Society and Its Fallacies, where he actually explained what the open society was, its roots, and why it was such a disastrous idea for societies to try to be completely open. In Kendall's estimation, the open society is one where pretty much everything, like the name says, is open. Anything can be said, anything can be questioned. The only dogma in the open society is that there is no dogma. Okay, there's a little paradox there. And he traced this idea to the 19th century British utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, who's probably most famous to us today because of his essay on liberty, which is actually where Mill articulated his idea for the open society. And in that essay on liberty, Mill actually said this, quote, "There ought to exist the fullest liberty of professing and discussing as a matter of ethical conviction any doctrine, however immoral it may be considered." Unquote. So there you go. That's what it actually meant. Anything can be brought up, anything can be discussed, anything can be questioned, no matter how ultra it is, no matter how far out there it is, no matter how immoral it is. Now, it's important to say, and actually Willmoore does this in his essay. He wants to make it very clear that Mill is not saying more than he actually is. So, for example, that doesn't mean that, children have to be indoctrinated with pornography when they're 5. Of course, we can protect children. This completely open society is sort of adult club, if you will. Once you pass into adulthood, then you can do that. You kids, you have to be protected. Mill is also not saying that laws against libel and slander can't happen either. However, Kendall also makes it very clear that Mill is not saying less than what he is actually saying. So, according to Mill's ideas, you should have the freedom to argue that incest, for example, okay, this is not Mill's example, okay, I'm just pulling one because it's relevant again, because now there is a case in New York where someone is actually trying to overturn New York State's incest laws. According to Mill, you should have complete freedom to argue that the incest laws all over the country should be repealed, and that fathers should be able to marry their daughters, sons should be able to marry their mothers, brothers and sisters should be able to marry each other, or heck, even now, brothers and brothers should be able to marry each other. Even if 99.99999 to infinity% of the population opposes it, even if people are afraid that, hey, you know what, this idea might actually catch on, people will get behind it, it'll just steamroll through the country, and pretty soon all the incest laws in America are going to be overturned. It doesn't matter. The very fact that that could happen, in Mill's estimation, means that that right has to be protected even more. So that is what Mill is saying. Complete and absolute freedom to argue for anything that you want, no matter how disgusting and immoral it is. And whether or not, disregarding what the odds are that people will actually get on board with the idea, doesn't matter. That is Mill's argument in a nutshell. It's also important to note that Mill completely understands that this extends beyond freedom of speech, because, as Willmoore points out, if people have the complete freedom of speech, if freedom of speech is elevated as the primal good above all other goods, then that means that freedom of thought must also be absolute as well, because, of course, you can't be absolutely free to speak anything you want if you also don't have complete freedom to think whatever you want. But then that also means that freedom of speech doesn't merely become freedom of thought and speech, it instead becomes society's ultimate standard of order. It then means that people have an absolute right to live however they want, to accord their own lives with what they think and how they speak, okay? Now, this is important because then it means that society instantly splinters and fragments and balkanizes into irreparable shards that can never be put back together. Now, why is that, you might be asking? Well, it's because if you take Mill's argument seriously, that there should absolutely be no barrier on what is said, what is spoken, and what is thought, and then what is acted out, in order so that it can agree with what is said and what is thought, then that means, like I said previously, there can be no dogma in the public square. You can't have, for example, a set of rules that says this is right, this is bad, this is how we live, this is how we are not going to live. The only dogma becomes that there is no dogma. And that gets you into a nice little paradox, because the only objective truth then that we have is that there is no objective truth, which of course raises the old standard Aristotelian question. Well, wait a minute. If the only objective truth is that there is no objective truth, then is that true? Is the statement there is no objective truth objectively true if there is no objective truth? You could go around and around in circles on the mental merry-go-round when you're thinking about that question, let me tell you. Now, the reason why Mill says this is because according to Mill, again, as Kendall says, as Kendall puts it in his essay on the open society and its fallacies, no truth has any claim to special treatment because all truths will turn out to be at least partially incorrect, because each competing idea is in itself a partial truth. So when you actually accept the idea of the open society, like people like Glenn Beck and Dave Rubin, David French have, then you are, whether you know it or not, you are accepting the premise that there is no objective truth. And that, I mean, just opens a whole new barrel of worms, because then that will immediately contradict what American conservatism supposedly stands for. So, for example, conservatives are the ones who say that there is an objective reality. That's why they used to say that marriage was only between a man and a woman. That's why they say now, hey, biological reality is real. So you can't just have a 6-year-old, boy transitioning to a girl because a teacher noticed that he liked pink and was using a Barbie doll as a gun. Okay, putting him on hormone blockers, dressing him up in dresses, letting his hair grow long and putting them in pigtails, that's not best for the child, for the family, for the school, for the community, because there's such a thing as biological reality. Or to take something even more basic, conservatives are the one who say that, hey, we have, as human beings, natural rights that flow from our essence as Homo sapiens, and that these rights come from God. It says so right there in the Declaration of Independence, which is the whole thing that actually started the revolution going. It's a bit more complicated and involved and interesting than that, but just for the sake of argument, we'll leave it at that for the time being. Well, how can you actually maintain those positions if there is no such thing as objective truth? You can't. And that's the point. And Mill completely understands that this is where his line of thought leads. According to Mill, the only thing that matters isn't truth and falsehood. It isn't order or chaos. It isn't justice or injustice. The only thing that matters is pure rationality. People get together, they hash out ideas, however outrageous they are, and then wherever rationality leads, i.e., however many people you get on board with your asinine idea, will win the day. And then this gets us to the second big problem of Mill's idea of the open society that Kendall points out, besides the whole overthrowing of objective truth. Because according to Kendall, this means that Mill's idea of society is simply a debating club. But as Kendall so eloquently points out, society is not a debating club. It is not the debating club par excellence, or the massive, ever-expanding, sprawling debating club, because societies aren't structured like that, because we aren't structured like that. Yes, the pursuit of truth is important and vital, but there are other things, other goods that societies also have to accomplish and need to accomplish in order to be societies to begin with. So, for example, survival is one that Kendall points out. That means actually maintaining order in society, which immediately means that you can't have an open society, because you're shattering society into irreparable shards. And here's the reason why, gang. Because if there is no objective truth, if there is no truth, then it means that this group can have its truth. 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 And they're all true for those groups based on where they are and what time they happen to be in and what their goal is at that specific point and specific place in time. So instead of actually having a united nation, all that we have now are disparate groups that are each clamoring about their own truth, and we have absolutely no way of bridging over those competing truths, because now we actually have no way of actually reasoning together. Because in order to reason together, we have to be able to say that there is an objective truth. There is a hierarching level of reality that we can actually access with our minds, with our intellects, with our rationality, that will allow us to see what the truth is. It might say that I'm right, might say that you're right, might say that we're both wrong, and we have to both find what the truth is together. But without that overarching objective truth, that higher level of reality, you have nothing. Discussion then simply becomes a screaming match, which then becomes a match of sheer willpower. Whoever has the bigger stick, physically or metaphorically, will win the day. And this is exactly what is happening right now in the United States. In case you hadn't noticed, gang, we have people on the left who say that there is no room in the public square for George Washington. Meanwhile, people on the right say we should honor and respect George Washington, while at the same time acknowledging that he was human and he made mistakes. We have people on the left who say now that we have to get rid of museums, because museums are now instigators of white patriarchy. Meanwhile, people on the right are saying, hey, if you don't like a statue, just put it into a museum, which you can't really do if there are no museums. You have people on the left who now say that race is the prism through which all of reality has to pass through. In fact, there is no other legitimate way of looking at the world, of looking at human interactions, except through race, which in and of itself is objective, while sex is subjective, but that's a whole nother line of thought. While the right says that no, you can't look at everything just through a racial lens, because it's madness. You're making the same mistake that Marx did, boiling everything down to one thing and then forcing everything through that way. Well, which one is right? You have people on the left burning the flag. You have people on the right crying, that disrespects vets. Who's right? If you live in an open society, you have to say that both are right. But that means left and right will never unite. It means that they can't even talk to each other, which is also why we're seeing this cold civil war that we've been in for at least a decade now becoming hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, where now, if you just happen to be in a certain place at a certain time, you're arrested, because you could potentially be a quote-unquote white terrorist. Or if you just happen to publicly disagree with a sitting member of Congress, the police will come knocking at your door because Capitol Police told your local police department that you threatened a sitting member of Congress. Now you might be saying at this point, Nate, that's all really interesting and okay. This very shoddily made video actually seems to be logically making sense through some small miracle. But it doesn't make any difference at the end of the day because we've got the First Amendment, and the First Amendment guarantees an open society because it guarantees freedom of speech. Well, there's a problem with that too, because I'm about to propose something really radical, gang. I am going to say that the First Amendment does not guarantee freedom of speech as we have been told it does by the left or the right. And I am going to once again turn to Willmoore Kendall, not in the essay that I was drawing on before, The Open Society and Its Fallacies, but from a book review that he actually wrote in 1964, a book review concerning a book entitled Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side, which was published in 1963 by Leonard W. Levi by Cambridge Harvard University Press. And in this book review, Kendall says that Levy has found an astounding, Levy has made an astounding discovery that the First Amendment does not actually mean that everyone has the right to say whatever they want. I'm going to pull out some quotes from Kendall's book review on Leonard Levi's book, Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side. Here we go. Levy states that the question as to the intention of the framers and of the generation that ratified the constitutional rule that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press boils down to whether they intended to abolish the common law of seditious libel. There is no evidence of any such intention on the part of any member of the Constitutional Convention or of the First Congress which drafted the Bill of Rights. At least freedom of speech had in America prior to the First Amendment or even later little or no history either as a concept or a practice. It was a concept without basis in everyday experience and nearly unknown to legal and constitutional history or even to libertarian thought. And to the extent it was known, it referred to the immunity of the legislator for utterances made in his official capacity, not to immunity of private individuals. Now, Kendall actually goes on. That was just the first volley, gang. The First Amendment happened where and when it could not possibly have happened, except to the extent we repeal the axiom that nothing is ever created out of nothing. How are we to explain the First Amendment brings us to a second and still more breathtaking set of Professor Levy's conclusions. Levy notes that the remote source of the First Amendment freedom of expression clauses appears to be a provision of Pennsylvania's first constitution adapted in 1776, that the people have a right to freedom of speech and of writing and of publishing their sentiments, therefore freedom of the press ought not to be restrained. But it is not true, as historical convention would have us believe, that the First Amendment merely bumped up to the federal level speech and press guarantees that were already familiar features in the state constitutions. 12 states had left speech entirely unprotected, and 4 had provided no constitutional protection for freedom of the press. Worse still, the history of Pennsylvania shows that the only one of the original states to protect constitutionally both speech and press did not intend to abandon the common law of seditious libel. The same thing appears to be true of the 8 states that protected the press. So therefore, even though the Constitution of 1787 protected speech, and even though some states like Pennsylvania actually did put protections for free speech in their state constitutions, it did not mean that the common laws against seditious libel were actually overthrown, which means that people did not have carte blanche to say whatever they wanted, to vomit up words just because they were in a particular mood in a particular day. And I would be remiss, gang, if I did not actually share a quote that Kendall puts in from Benjamin Franklin, who, just is always worth quoting. The freedom, okay, this is Kendall. I'm moving up to Benjamin Franklin's quote. The freedom toward which the Constitution makers were groping was a freedom to write, print, or utter anything that was temperate, accurate, well-intentioned, and that fell short of what a court or the community might deem seditious or libelous. Benjamin Franklin put the idea very well when he wrote that if freedom of the press meant the liberty of discussing the propriety of public measures and public opinions, let us have as much of it as you please. But as to writers who affront the government's reputation, we should, in moderation, content ourselves with tarring and feathering and tossing them in a blanket. And this actually goes further than even Kendall puts it, gang. In 1838, a man by the name of Abner Kneeland was prosecuted in Massachusetts for blasphemy. Yes, not only were the common laws against seditious libel allowed to stand even after the First Amendment was ratified, but state laws against blasphemy were actually kept on the books, and there was absolutely no contradiction between the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of speech and state laws against blasphemy. Abner Kneeland was actually convicted by the Massachusetts Superior Court in 1838 for blasphemy and sentenced to 2 years in prison when he wrote a tract where he said he didn't believe in the divinity of Christ, he didn't believe in God, he didn't believe in the resurrection, the immortality of the soul, etc., etc. For that, he was put into the can for 2 years. Even though, and it was not overturned, gang, there was no Supreme Court decision that said that Massachusetts state law contradicted federal law, and therefore it was null and void. There was none of that. Now, the historically astute YouTube's community will point out that Abner Kneeland went into jail a hero, a local hero, and he came out to greater accolades. They will also point out that he reprinted that pamphlet that actually got him thrown into the can in the first place immediately after getting out, and that the local officials of Massachusetts did nothing, and that his case in 1838 was actually the last case where an American was prosecuted for blasphemy. And all of that is true. I fully and freely admit it right up front here. But that does not change the fundamental point, gang, that the First Amendment freedom of speech guarantee went alongside state laws against seditious libel and blasphemy. The two coexisted for years. Which means that the people who actually fought the revolution, who actually wrote the Constitution, who actually built, created, and maintained the early republic saw no contradiction between the two ideas. You could have freedom of speech and you could have laws against seditious libel, against blasphemy, etc., etc. And what this means, gang, is that conservatism, in the words of Jack Nicholson, needs an enema. Because for too long now, we have been fed this slop that we have to allow people the ability to say anything that they want, and we can't fight back. Look at, for example, David French, Brad Palumbo, and others of their Jonah Goldberg, saying that we can't pass laws against critical race theory. We can't have state laws against that, which forbid it's actually being taught in public schools because, my God, that's a direct attack on free speech and it's all slippery slope from here. That's not constitutional, gang. That's not originalism, and that's not even good common sense. The Founding Fathers would be appalled by such an argument because they would understand that, hey, if you allow speech that actually undermines the very foundation of your homeland, you don't have anything. Because in that case, you can't just naively hope to the goodness and the rationality of the people to see the fib and go for the truth. We have 3,000 years of history that prove that people just aren't that smart. We have to return to the idea, gang, that freedom of speech does not guarantee us the right to simply vomit up words, but that the right of free speech means that we have the duty to temper our speech to what is true. That doesn't mean that we have to be very posh and sophisticated and my. No. You can state the truth plainly and bluntly, and more people actually need to do that. But it also means that you don't just have carte blanche to run your mouth off and say, oh, it's free speech, which means that we have to get it out of our heads that the answer to the left's censorship, the answer to their lies, isn't just more speech. It's the truth. And it also means that we have to wrap it around our heads that that protecting our children, protecting the integrity of our homeland, protecting its basic symbols is not unconstitutional. And that, in fact, you can't have a country, you can't have conservatism unless you actually protect those things. Because I'll just state it right here, gang. If free speech means, if your argument is that free speech means that you can just desecrate our basic symbols of our homeland, if it means that we have to allow children to be sacrificed to critical race theory, to gender theory, because not everyone is going to be convinced by your arguments, no matter how good they are, FYI, if it means that the country itself, the very thing that is protecting free speech, has to be undermined, then you are just as ideologically driven as anyone on the left, and you are going to lose. No. With sword of truth, we turn to fight the satanic powers of the night. That's what the founders did, and that's what we have to do now as well. And before we go, gang, after having said all that, I think it's time for a silver lining.
So always look for the silver lining and try to find the sunny side of life.
And since we are in Independence Day mode around here on the Stone, we are actually doing two silver linings, a book and a movie. The book is David McCullough's 2005 follow-up to his Pulitzer Prize winning biography of John Adams, his 2005 book 1776, which is actually all the research that he did for John Adams that he couldn't put into that book. And so he wrote an entirely new book, which, as the title suggests, is just about the year 1776. And it is an eye-opener, gang. First, it's written in McCullough's very easy to follow style. His books read like novels, which means that the information just sticks in your head because he brings the people to life, which, FYI, is the first duty of any historian. And because it reminds us that while, yes, we have nostalgic ideas about 1776 because that was the year that the Declaration was written and signed, aside from that, it was a very dark year for the American Revolution, the American cause. Defeat after defeat in the military field delivered to the American forces by the British. In fact, by December of 1776, most of the world, most of Europe, and even a lot of people in America thought that the revolution was over. Good try, guys, but didn't work. And it was in large part Washington's tenacity, his stubbornness, his stoicism that actually won the day, that kept the army together because he refused to see things were black as they were. That's the first silver lining. The second one is a movie, 1993's Gettysburg, which is one of the best war films I have ever seen. Granted, haven't seen very many. They're not my cup of tea, but this one is superb, gang. Primarily not just because of the acting, not just because of the attention to detail that the movie, strives for in every scene, but because it does what is so hard to do. It presents North and South, not as evil, not as good, but as men. One side isn't the hero, one side isn't the evil antagonist. No, they are both simply fighting. Both sides are fighting for what they genuinely, truly believe. And therefore their humanity is allowed to be shown on the screen for us to criticize, for us to honor, for us to recoil at, but they stand there in their deeds, looming much larger than most people today ever will. David McCullough, 1776, 1993's Gettysburg. Read them this month. Watch it this month and enjoy it. And with that, gang, I am wrapping up things. Thank you for being patient. We did another one of these impromptu videos because I wanted to make this even without a fully completed script, so thank you for your patience. And if you liked this video, if I haven't scared you away, and if you actually like videos that deal with culture, religion, and politics from a unique POV, then subscribe to the channel, ring that bell for Quasimodo so you will always know when I put new videos up. And before you go, if you could smash that like button, leave a comment telling me why you agreed, why you disagreed, and if you could share it on social media with your friends, I would be very much obliged. Helps me and the channel immensely. Thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed. I appreciate you all, gang. I appreciate every single one of you. Until then, stay safe, stay free, have a very happy and very blessed Independence Day, and I will see you all soon on the other side. Ciao.